Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a topic that hits close to home for many folks out there, and that is your rights when you're dealing with law enforcement, especially when it comes to immigration. You guys have given us some articles and guides about what to do if you find yourself face-to-face with immigration officers and how to prepare a safety plan for your family in those situations. So let's unpack all of this.
Yeah, it's actually pretty fascinating how much misinformation there is out there.
Yeah.
And how many people, regardless of their immigration status, just really aren't sure about what their basic rights are.
Right.
So this deep dive, hopefully, will give you guys the knowledge to be able to navigate these situations confidently and safely.
One thing that really jumped out at me from these materials is just how much emphasis there is on your constitutional rights. You know, it's like, oh, yeah, right, those still apply.
Yeah.
Everybody in the U.S. has these certain protections, no matter what their immigration status is.
Exactly. And I think one of the most crucial ones is the right to remain silent.
Right. And this applies across the board, not just in immigration situations.
Right. So it's not just something they say on TV.
Yeah.
But in these guides, they give really specific advice about interacting with law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And they make a distinction between police officers and immigration officers.
Right. And that's key because immigration officers might identify themselves as police, but they're not actually from the police department.
Right.
You want to be thinking ICE or CPP.
Gotcha.
During a traffic stop, for example, you really need to clarify who exactly you're dealing with.
Yeah, so standard procedure, I guess, if it's a regular police officer.
Right.
But if you encounter an immigration officer, then it seems like the advice really changes depending on whether you have documentation.
Exactly. So for documented individuals, so that's U.S. citizens or people who have legal status, it's really important to carry proof of that with you at all times, like a passport, green card, work permit, whatever it may be.
Always have that on you. Be prepared to show it. But for undocumented individuals, the advice is completely different.
Yeah.
In those cases, it's actually best to stay silent and avoid discussing your immigration status altogether.
That seems counterintuitive, right? Like, wouldn't you want to try to explain yourself?
I know it can be tempting, but anything you say can actually be used against you in immigration court.
Oh, wow.
And this is where it's really important to understand that difference between a civil offense and a crime.
Okay.
Being undocumented is actually a civil offense.
Gotcha.
Unless the individual re-entered the U.S. illegally after being deported.
So it's not like a criminal matter unless you've got that added element of, like, re-entry.
Right.
Okay. So what are the implications of it being a civil matter as opposed to criminal?
Well, it means, different processes, different courts, and potentially, different consequences compared to a criminal charge. But it's still something to take very seriously.
Right, of course. Okay, that distinction actually makes that stay silent advice even more crucial.
Absolutely. And this same principle applies if immigration officers show up at your home. Don't open the door unless they have a warrant that's been signed by a judge.
Okay.
And that does not include those ICE warrants that you often hear about.
Wait, so those aren't actually from a judge? I thought those were like the official, go ahead.
Nope. Those ICE warrants are actually more like internal forms.
Gotcha.
They don't automatically give them permission to enter your home without your consent. You have the right to refuse.
Wow. Okay, that's a big deal. What about if you just witness immigration activity happening? Like, say you're a U.S. citizen and you see, like, ICE detaining someone. What's the guidance there?
Well, the guides recommend documenting the activity if you feel safe doing so. So that would mean recording a video or taking detailed notes.
Okay.
But never interfere with the operation.
Right. So be a witness, but not a vigilante. It seems like the bottom line is knowing your rights and staying calm is really paramount no matter what the scenario is.
You got it. And that's crucial even if, let's say, ICE approaches you directly. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to refuse to sign anything without speaking to a lawyer. And they can't enter your home without a valid warrant signed by a judge.
Got it. Stay calm, know your rights, and don't be afraid to assert them.
Exactly.
Sounds simple enough, but I imagine it's much harder in a real-life situation.
Oh, absolutely. The pressure can be really intense. And that's why it's so important to be prepared.
Right.
Speaking of being prepared, these materials debunk a pretty common myth.
Oh, okay.
The idea that you can avoid deportation by simply not revealing your country of origin.
Yeah, the if they don't know where to send you back to tactic.
Exactly.
Does that ever actually work?
Unfortunately, no, it doesn't.
Okay.
The sources point out that the U.S. deports roughly 200,000 immigrants annually. So claiming ignorance of your origin isn't really a practical solution in such a vast system.
Right, they're going to find out.
Yeah. Plus, there are ways for authorities to, figure out your nationality.
Right. So for someone listening who maybe is feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this, what would you say is the crucial takeaway?
I think the crucial takeaway is that creating a safety plan is absolutely essential,
Okay.
especially if you have a family. You really want to think ahead and prepare for those different scenarios.
And the guides actually provide some concrete steps for doing that.
Right.
Like they recommend identifying emergency contacts and memorizing their numbers, and also making sure that your child's school or daycare has this information as well.
Right. And it's also about being proactive.
Hmm.
So giving written authorization to your emergency contact to be able to make medical or legal decisions for your child, just in case.
Oh, that's smart. Like you're creating that safety net.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're thinking ahead.
Yeah.
And another thing is that ICE detainee locator tool.
Right.
It's worth letting your loved ones know that that exists so they can find you if you're detained.
Right. Yeah. It's something you hope you'd never need, but good to have in your back pocket.
Right.
All of these guides, they really seem to be about like taking control where you can and minimizing that unknown.
Exactly. And I think those steps can really help reduce a lot of the stress and the uncertainty that can come with dealing with an already difficult situation.
Absolutely. So another big topic that came up is guardianship,
Yeah,
which seems especially important for families who are worried about being separated.
absolutely. When we talk about appointing a guardian for your children, what we're talking about is a legal arrangement where an adult who is not the parent is authorized to care for the child and make decisions on their behalf.
Right. So like a stand-in parent, essentially.
Right.
Making choices about their well-being, their education, all that. But I'm guessing there's not like a one-size-fits-all approach to guardianship.
Right. There are different types of guardianship to fit different situations.
Okay.
And probably the most common one mentioned in these guides is short-term guardianship.
Okay.
And that's designed for more temporary situations.
Yeah.
You don't actually need to go through the courts for this kind.
Okay.
It's more about having a signed agreement in place.
Gotcha. So like if a parent is detained or just needs somebody to look after their kid for a short period, this is what they would use.
Exactly. It's a little simpler and faster to set up,
Mm.
but either parent can cancel it at any time.
Okay.
Then you have standby guardianship, which kicks in under specific circumstances that are predefined.
Okay.
And that does involve the court system.
So I imagine those circumstances would have to be like really clearly spelled out in
Yeah.
the agreement.
Exactly. And then for the more long-term arrangements, that's where plenary guardianship comes in.
Okay.
That's for situations that are more permanent, and it definitely involves, the most legal hoops. It requires going to court and establishing that the parent is unable to care for the child for, an extended period of time.
Right. So if a parent is like facing deportation and knows they're not going to be able to care for their kid for a long time, this might be the route they go.
Exactly. It provides more stability and more legal clarity compared to a short-term guardianship.
Right. Okay. So for any of these types of guardianship, who can actually be appointed as a guardian?
Well, there are some legal requirements in terms of the guardian's age and their ability to provide proper care.
All right.
But I think what the sources really highlight is the importance of really careful consideration beyond just those basic requirements.
Sure.
It's about finding someone who's trustworthy, who shares your values, who can provide a stable and loving environment for your child. Location is a factor too. You want to minimize the disruption to the child's life as much as possible.
It sounds like it's not a decision to be taken lightly.
Yeah.
So, and speaking of weighty matters, how does all of this work if a parent is detained or even deported? Can they still make arrangements for their kids from afar?
Yeah, it's definitely more complex, but there are options.
Okay.
So for short-term guardianship, they could prepare and sign the agreement before being detained,
Okay.
or even from their home country, if communication allows.
Okay.
For court-ordered guardianships, things get a little trickier. The proposed guardian and the child would need to be present in court.
Okay.
but the parent wouldn't necessarily have to be there physically.
Oh,
There are
Sarah.
ways to participate remotely.
Okay. So even being separated by distance or detention doesn't totally block a parent from making those arrangements.
Right.
What about the rights of the other parent in all of this?
That's a really important point to bring up. So for those short-term agreements, either parent can revoke it, right?
Okay.
But for anything that's court-ordered, a parent who wasn't part of the decision could actually challenge that in court.
Gotcha.
And usually, the courts will side with the parent who was left out, especially if it's in the best interest of the child.
Right. It makes sense. Like, you wouldn't want one parent making these huge life-altering choices without the other one's knowledge or consent.
Exactly.
So I know we've been focusing on guardianship within the U.S., but what if a parent is deported and wants their kids to, you know, join them in their home country? How does that all work?
Well, first and foremost, the children need passports.
Okay.
American-born children would need U.S. passports, obviously,
Right.
whereas foreign-born children would need passports from their country of origin.
Okay.
And the sources really recommend getting those passports while the children are still with the parent, if at all possible,
Sure.
just to avoid any complications later on.
Right. Because trying to, like, sort out passports from different countries after separation would be a nightmare, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So, and then what about actually traveling with the kids? Like, does the type of guardianship matter?
It does, yes. Taking children out of the country with just a short-term guardianship agreement is very risky.
Okay.
Airlines and immigration officials might not allow it
Gotcha.
because, there's really no legal backing.
Right. So somebody with a court-ordered guardianship would have more authority in that situation.
Absolutely, yes.
So again, we see that level of like legal formality really matters depending on the situation.
It does. And I think it's really important to remember that this is a very nuanced area of law.
Right.
The sources really stress the importance of seeking legal counsel,
Okay.
especially if you have, unique circumstances like a child with special needs, or if you're dealing with undocumented children. An immigration attorney can provide personalized advice and really help you explore all the options.
Right. Like potentially seeking legal status for the child, if that's a possibility.
Exactly.
Okay. So for listeners in Illinois who want more information specifically about guardianship, like where can they go?
The sources recommend contacting Chicago Volunteer Legal Services or the Guardianship Assistance Desk for minors. They can provide a lot of really useful information and help you navigate the process.
Okay. And for immigration-related legal questions and screenings, they recommend the National Immigrant Justice Center.
That's right.
Okay. So these organizations can offer valuable help and support during what is, probably a very stressful and confusing time.
Right. It's really about empowering yourself with knowledge and knowing where to go for help.
Absolutely. Knowing your rights and having a plan can make a world of difference.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It really can. And it's striking to me, how interconnected all these issues are. Like we've been talking about rights and safety planning and guardianship. They all kind of tie into this idea of like creating a sense of security and agency for yourself and your family, even when things feel really uncertain.
Yeah, it's like you're building a fortress. But the bricks are knowledge and preparation.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And just like building a fortress, it's an ongoing process. So this deep dive is hopefully giving you some like sturdy foundations.
Right.
But you always want to keep learning and asking questions and kind of adapting your plan as needed.
Right, because laws change. Situations evolve. New challenges pop up.
Exactly. And remember that even though we've covered a lot today, it's always best to talk to, an actual legal professional
Right.
to get advice that's specifically tailored to your situation.
Of course.
Because what we've discussed are sort of general principles,
Right.
but the application of the law can be super nuanced.
Right. It's like we've given you the toolkit,
Yeah.
but you might need an expert to help you figure out which tool to use and how to use it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to reach out for help. Like those organizations that we mentioned, they're great resources.
Absolutely. So if there was like one thing for our listener to take away from this whole deep dive, what would it be?
I think it would be the power of being proactive. Don't wait until something happens to start thinking about your rights or your safety plan or those potential guardianship arrangements. Like the more you know, the more prepared you are and the more empowered you'll feel to handle whatever comes your way.
Knowledge is power. Preparation is key. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, all this information we shared, it's just a starting point, so keep digging deeper, keep asking questions, and most importantly, stay empowered.